Unknowns present us with four major adaptive challenges: dealing with unforeseen threats and solving problems, benefiting from opportunities for exploration and discovery, crafting good outcomes in a partially learnable world, dealing intelligently and sociably with other humans. No single way of dealing with ignorance suffices to meet all four of these challenges under all possible circumstances. So, in this lecture, we'll explore 6 ways that people can manage ignorance, and when each of them may help and when they may not. I'll start off by just describing each of them. As I do, you may want to observe which of them you think are useful and which you think are not, and why. First, we can banish unknowns by setting them aside. Perhaps the most common example of banishment is when we hand an unknown over to someone else, such as an expert, to deal with. Another example is when we decide that we're not going to deal with an unknown because it isn't important or because we lack the necessary resources. Second, there's denial. We can deny that there are unknowns or that we're ignorant about something, even in the face of evidence to the contrary. Identifying instances of our own denial usually can be done only in hindsight, but it's relatively easy to attribute denial to someone else. Thus, denial has some of the same properties as meta-ignorance. Third is reduction. We can reduce unknowns by finding out more information or by introducing controls or constraints that eliminate unknowns. So, the most obvious examples of reduction are research and various kinds of engineering, both material and social. A fourth approach is acceptance, or toleration. We can decide that we will take unknowns into account when we make decisions. Most volitional risk-taking is an example. We may know that there are risks in our investment portfolio, but we regard those risks as worth taking. Fifth is relinquishment, which usually entails adopting a fatalistic or nihilistic stance towards unknowns. An example is any belief system in which one's unknown fate or destiny is determined by supernatural entities such as spirits or gods. Sixth, and finally, is generation. We can seek out, amplify, or create unknowns. Improvisation in the arts is one kind of example, as is the creation of new unknowns in the process of scientific research. Another type of example is the ambiguous forms of communication we use when we're being polite or tactful. Now, most of us will prefer some of these coping strategies over others. In fact, different cultures may emphasize different subsets of these strategies and thereby socialize people into such preferences. Western cultures, for instance, strongly favor and reward reduction and banishment. Nevertheless, a key point in this lecture is that any of these ways of coping with ignorance can be adaptive or maladaptive, depending on our goals and circumstances. Let's begin with what may seem like the worst candidate, denial. When could denial of unknowns or ignorance be adaptive? A short answer is that denial is adaptive when action is needed, but acknowledging ignorance would result in inaction. It isn't difficult to find commonplace examples where denial is at least temporarily adaptive. Many of them involve taking a risk to achieve a goal while denying that the risk exists. If the alternative is panic or paralysis, then the goal won't be achieved. The example that comes to my mind is when I was a child learning to swim. The first time I swam out into deep water. Conversely, examples where denial is maladaptive are situations in which learning or discovery is needed, because these usually require facing unknowns directly. What about banishment? Like denial, banishment can be useful if the alternative is paralysis in situations where action is needed. Professor Aileen Plant headed the team responsible for dealing with the outbreak of an unknown disease in Vietnam that turned out to be SARS. Her team had to make rapid decisions before knowing anything about the disease, and they adopted a coping strategy akin to banishment. As she put it, "We considered the SARS organism was most likely a virus and spread predominantly via the respiratory route. Hence, we acted as though that was true, meaning that infection control, patient management, patient isolation, and so on were all treated as though SARS was similar to other viruses." Another seemingly maladaptive response is relinquishment, which sounds like giving up and letting unknown forces determine events. However, in some theological traditions, not only is relinquishment an essential component of faith, but any alternative is blasphemous or dangerous. At a more quotidian level, relinquishment often is part of the discovery process that begins with the discoverer saying, "Let's see what happens." And related to faith, trust relationships involve a degree of relinquishment, with the trustee placing their fate in the hands of the trusted. There also is a rich tradition of relinquishment to unknowns in most of the arts as an avenue to creativity and innovation. As we saw in the interview with art historian Sasha Grishin, visual artists have allowed chance or unpredictable environmental influences into their art. Likewise, musicians and composers have incorporated random elements in their music. Now let's turn to the coping strategy favored by modern Western cultures, reduction. Reducing or eliminating unknowns certainly has many uses, especially when learning or discovery is required, and also when people are to be held accountable for their decisions. One of the most common stereotypes of science is that it is all about reducing ignorance. Viewed in this way, if there are enough resources and time, reducing unknowns would seem to be preferable to any of the alternatives. Of course, one of its drawbacks is that research invariably generates new unknowns as it vanquishes old ones, and there often are not sufficient resources or time, and some unknowns are irreducible. Gaining knowledge isn't the only way to eliminate unknowns. Tyranny and oppression are ways of reducing unknowns too, by eliminating freedom of action. More benign examples of reduction in this connection are any legal or bureaucratic system backed by policies and legal statutes. Virtually any kind of social engineering involves reducing unknowns. For example, safe sex campaigns by health authorities, or marketing campaigns by corporations to influence consumer behavior. Viewed this way, the utility of reducing unknowns becomes much more debatable and raises questions of when and for whom it is adaptable. This viewpoint also brings to mind that attempts to reduce people's freedom are likely to be resisted, which may result in proliferating unknowns rather than reducing them. Acceptance or tolerance can be adaptive, especially if reduction is impossible, unaffordable, or politically unviable. Tolerance of unknowns also is an essential aspect of making decisions that are robust against unforeseeable future events, and so tolerance of unknowns increasingly appears in popular risk management frameworks. The most obvious potential difficulties with acceptance arise from resultant exposure to risk. Inequities, violations of rights, or threats to fundamental values entailed by risk exposure may limit the viability of accepting unknowns. Finally, when can generating unknowns be adaptive? People do this all the time, as we've seen in earlier parts of this course. A considerable portion of social interaction involves using ambiguity, indirection, or even lies in the service of civility, politeness, and other social goals. Creating unknowns that are appropriate to social interaction is an important way of being sociable. In connection with reducing unknowns via tyranny or oppression, gaining personal freedom entails creating unknowns for one's own future. In discussing ways of coping with ignorance, I've neglected an important strategy that often is part of reduction or tolerance, but deserves attention on its own. We could try to improve our ignorance. Improving ignorance is what some scientists, such as Stuart Firestein, believe is the core enterprise of science. This is one of the chief motivations that researchers have for not only finding answers, but also finding new and better questions. So in the next lecture, we'll examine what it means to improve ignorance, and some methods for doing so.